A surprising number of Kawasaki throttle problems trace back to everyday riding habits, not a factory defect. Most riders are doing at least one of them right now without knowing it. Here are 5 habits that can quietly wear down your throttle, and how to avoid them before they turn into a repair bill. Number 5. Blipping the throttle at startup. That quick throttle blip, the second the engine fires up, feels satisfying, especially on a Ninja or a Z series with a throaty exhaust note. But on Kawasaki's electronic throttle valve models, that habit is worth rethinking. Kawasaki's ETV system uses a motor-driven throttle valve controlled by sensor input rather than a physical cable. And like most electronic throttle systems, it typically needs a short window right after startup to settle into its normal operating state. Blipping the throttle during that window isn't something that's going to damage the bike on the spot, but some riders and technicians report that bikes ridden this way regularly can end up with a slightly inconsistent idle or a throttle response that feels a bit off over time. It's not a guaranteed outcome, and if it does happen, it's unlikely to trigger a warning light, so it can be easy to miss the connection. The fix costs nothing either way. Turn the ignition on, let the dash lights cycle, and the system complete its startup check, then start the engine and give it a few seconds of idle before touching the throttle. It's a small habit change that removes the risk entirely, whether or not it was ever actually causing a problem. This habit tends to be more common on sport bikes than cruisers or adventure models, simply because the startup blip is part of the ritual for a lot of sport riders. If that sounds familiar, it doesn't mean anything has gone wrong yet. It just means it's worth breaking the habit now rather than leaving it to chance. It's also worth saying that older, carbureted, or cable throttle bikes never had this concern in the first place, since there was no electronic system to calibrate. It's really a byproduct of moving to fly-by-wire throttle systems, and a lot of riders coming from older bikes simply haven't updated their habits to match the newer tech underneath them. Number 4. Riding with a dirty or corroded throttle position sensor connector. This one has nothing to do with how you ride, and everything to do with what riders skip during a wash or a winter storage prep. The throttle position sensor connector sits right at the throttle body, exposed to road spray and moisture, and it's rarely part of anyone's regular cleaning routine. The TPS sends a signal to the ECU that reflects throttle position, and like most electrical connectors exposed to the elements, it can accumulate corrosion or moisture over time. A degraded connection at this sensor is a plausible contributor to symptoms some riders report, like hesitation, a rough patch in the power delivery, or occasional limp mode behavior. It's worth being clear that these symptoms can have several different causes, and a dirty connector is just one possibility among them, but it's also one of the easiest ones to rule out. Faults tied to connectors like this can be intermittent, showing up in wet conditions and disappearing once things dry out, which can make them frustrating to track down, and sometimes leads to a diagnostic visit that doesn't turn up anything obvious. Prevention is simple regardless. Every few months, or after a ride in heavy rain, disconnect the TPS connector, apply a small amount of dielectric grease to the pins, and reseat it firmly. It's a 2-minute job that removes one more variable from the equation. Riders who commute year-round or store their bike outside are probably more exposed to this than most, since the connector doesn't get much of a chance to dry out and stay clean. If a bike has spent much of its life parked outdoors, it's worth checking that connector even if the throttle currently feels fine. It's a habit worth pairing with a general electrical check too. Bikes with any exposed connectors near the engine or exhaust, not just the throttle sensor, benefit from an occasional look and a bit of dielectric grease. It's the kind of maintenance that rarely makes anyone's checklist because nothing about it looks urgent, right up until it is. If you've been enjoying the video so far, we would really appreciate it if you subscribe to our channel as it helps us to grow. Now, back to the list. Number 3. Chasing full throttle from a cold start. This habit overlaps with general engine care, but it's also relevant to the throttle body itself, not just the engine internals. Twisting the throttle wide open in the first few minutes of a cold start is something a lot of riders don't think twice about, but it's generally considered worth avoiding. The reasoning is similar to why mechanics advise against revving a cold engine hard in general. Components that rely on lubrication, including the moving parts of the throttle body, are less well lubricated when everything is cold. and forcing rapid movement through them isn't ideal. This doesn't mean one cold full throttle pull is going to break anything. It's more that doing it consistently over a long period of time is the kind of habit that can contribute to premature wear in ways that are hard to notice until they add up. The fix is just patience. Give the bike a short idle after a cold start, then ease into the first mile or two with smoother throttle inputs before opening it all the way up. It costs a few minutes at most, and it's a low-effort way to protect a part that isn't cheap to replace if it does wear out early. This is worth taking a bit more seriously in cold weather, since cold generally makes clearances tighter and lubrication slower to circulate throughout a bike, not just the throttle body specifically. It's an easy habit to justify skipping because the bike still feels fine in the moment, and any wear that does happen isn't something a rider is likely to feel happening in real time. A useful way to think about it: the first mile of any ride is the one time the whole bike, not just the engine, hasn't fully settled into its normal operating state. Treating that first mile as a warm-up, rather than the start of the real ride, is a small mental shift that protects more than just the throttle body. Number 2. Ignoring throttle body sync on multi-cylinder models. This one applies mainly to Kawasaki's inline-4 and triple-cylinder bikes, where each cylinder has its own throttle bore. On these engines, the throttle bodies are meant to be synchronized, so each cylinder gets a comparable amount of airflow at a given throttle position. It's not a maintenance item most riders think about, since it isn't a fluid check or a filter swap. It's a mechanical adjustment that a lot of owners assume the bike just handles on its own. Over time, and with normal wear, throttle bodies on multi-cylinder engines can drift slightly out of sync with each other. When that happens, some cylinders may end up pulling a bit more or less air than others. This doesn't usually cause the engine to fail, but it can show up as a rough idle, a slight surge when opening the throttle from a stop, or a general loss of smoothness that's easy to write off as just how the bike feels. If left unaddressed for a long time, this kind of imbalance is generally understood to put a bit of extra strain on the components involved, since some cylinders end up working harder than others on a consistent basis. A throttle body sync isn't a quick job like the earlier items on this list. It typically requires a vacuum gauge or a dedicated sync tool and some careful, patient adjustment. It's something a lot of riders learn to do themselves, and it's generally worth checking periodically, especially alongside other scheduled maintenance, rather than waiting until something feels noticeably off. Riders on single-cylinder or twin-cylinder Kawasaki's can mostly skip this one, since there are fewer throttle bores involved and sync drift tends to be far less noticeable. But on an inline-4 or a triple, it's a real maintenance item worth keeping on the radar, not something to treat as optional. It's also one of those services that's easy to forget, precisely because the symptoms creep in so gradually. A bike that drifts slightly out of sync over months doesn't feel like it's changed day to day, so riders often adapt to the rougher idle or the small surge without realizing anything's different, right up until a sync brings it back, and the difference becomes obvious in comparison. Number 1. Riding through a limp mode, warning instead of stopping. This is the habit most likely to turn a cheap fix into an expensive one, and it's the reason it sits at number 1. When a Kawasaki ECU detects a throttle-related fault, it can trigger what's commonly called limp mode, usually shown as a flashing FI light on the dash, along with restricted RPM and throttle response as a built-in protective measure. The problem is that limp mode is designed to still let the bike move, sometimes well enough that a rider decides to just finish the ride or deal with it later. That decision is where a minor issue has the potential to become a bigger one. The general logic here is straightforward. Limp mode exists because the ECU isn't confident in the data it's receiving, so continuing to ride means the bike keeps making decisions based on information it has already flagged as unreliable. Depending on what's actually causing the fault, that can mean continuing to run a sensor or component that's already struggling, or riding with a fueling condition that isn't quite right. It's hard to say with certainty what will happen in any individual case, and it may resolve into nothing serious. But riding through it removes the safety margin the system was designed to give. What should happen instead is straightforward. The moment the FI light starts flashing and the bike enters limp mode, pull over as soon as it's safe and shut the engine off for a short period, often around 30 seconds or so. This gives the ECU a chance to reset and recheck itself on the next start. In some cases, this clears things up entirely and the bike returns to normal. If the light comes back, that's generally a good signal to get the bike scanned before putting more miles on it, rather than after. A diagnostic check is almost always going to be cheaper than the repair that can result from continuing to ride on a fault that gets worse. It's worth being honest about why this habit is so common. Limp mode is meant to be survivable on purpose, so the bike can get somewhere safe instead of shutting down outright. But that same design is what makes it easy to treat as a minor inconvenience rather than a warning. The bike still moves, still gets the rider home, so the instinct is often to deal with it later. Riders who avoid the more expensive outcomes tend to be the ones who treat that flashing light as a reason to stop the first time it appears, not the third or fourth. There's also a simple risk versus reward argument here that doesn't rely on knowing exactly what's wrong under the hood. A short stop and a reset costs almost nothing in time or money. Continuing to ride on an unresolved fault, whatever it turns out to be, is the only path on this list that can genuinely escalate a problem while it's actively happening. That asymmetry alone is reason enough to treat the warning seriously every time. Every one of these habits is common because none of them feel like they're doing damage in the moment. A blip at startup, a full throttle pull on a cold engine, riding through a warning light because the bike still moves. None of it looks dangerous until a problem shows up down the line. The good news is that every fix on this list costs little to nothing and takes minutes, not hours. Giving the throttle system a moment to settle at startup, keeping the TPS connector clean, warming up before opening the throttle, staying on top of sync checks, and stopping as soon as limp mode triggers are all small habits that go a long way toward keeping a Kawasaki throttle running the way it's supposed to. If this video helped you catch a habit you didn't know you had, tap that subscribe button so more riders can catch it too. Ride smart, and we'll see you in the next one.